I was driving back home from work late one night when I noticed Google Maps indicating that there was a crash on the Garden State Parkway. Great, I thought to myself. The ETA shot up from 35 minutes to an hour and a half. Must have been some big-ass crash for the ETA to go up by an hour. So the stretch of the parkway that I commute on has a speed limit of 55 miles per hour, but if you've ever been here, you'll know that hardly anyone drives below 75. I mean, what kind of inbred thought it was a good idea to limit the speed to 55 on a 5-lane parkway where you don't even have trucks? So obviously, no one follows the speed limit. That being said, people drive like maniacs up here, although I'm sure most of us feel the same way about all our states. So, inevitably, when we do have crashes on the parkway, they're usually pretty horrific. The ETA shooting up so drastically was mildly surprising since there were hardly any cars around me at all. But then again, it was almost midnight on a Saturday. We were going through our busy season, which meant working on weekends. I sighed out loud and decided to take the next exit that crossed my path. Driving through all the towns wouldn't be enjoyable, but it would still get me home faster. I had just crossed exit 135, so I figured I'd have to take exit 136. To my surprise, I noticed a board for exit 135D. I hadn't noticed any boards for exits 135A, B, or C. Hell, I didn't even remember ever noticing any exits between 135 and 136. I checked the maps and they didn't indicate any such exit. That should have been my first red flag. My gut told me to skip this exit and use the next one. But if we listened to our gut all the time, Nosleep would be a dead place, wouldn't it? As I drove towards the exit, I noticed the green board with the exit's name was faded and chipped off at places. It was dark and late at night, so I thought I just imagined it. I soon crossed a board that I believe said entering the town of Morristown. I laughed at the thought that this was probably a ripoff of Morristown, a pretty sweet town close to where I live. I looked at my cell phone on the GPS holder, and it indicated that I had lost network. Fuck Verizon, I thought to myself. I drove for another 5 to 10 minutes before realizing my GPS still indicated that my car was on the parkway, stationary. Weird, but maybe the lack of network was fucking with Google Maps. The town itself was silent, but again, it must have been a little past midnight, so I figured maybe this wasn't exactly the type of town that enjoyed its nightlife. The streetlights were extremely dim, and the night was foggy, so I actually had to switch my car's lights to the high beam mode. It's unsafe, especially when you're driving through a town, but there was absolutely no cars around, so I figured I was fine. I'd dim them down if I saw somebody. That's when I noticed a few people standing at a bus stop. I hadn't seen any buses since I had gotten in here, which again was odd. I slowed down near the bus stop to ask them for directions to the next town. As I approached them, I saw them staring blankly into nothingness. All of them were dressed in black. By this time, I was growing a little concerned. Concerned by the fact that there didn't seem to be any cars or buses in this town. Concerned by the fact that every single shop seemed closed. Concerned by the fact that the only people I'd seen so far seemed like they hadn't seen sunlight in years. They turned their heads in my direction and started slowly dragging themselves towards my car as I slowed down. I say dragging and not walking because their movement seemed to indicate that their minds wanted to stay put, but their bodies forced them to move. I didn't stop. These didn't seem to be the type of people who'd be helpful. I noticed that the boards outside most of the shops still indicated that they were open, but the lights were turned off, flickering on and off in some cases. My concern was growing. I approached a huge building that appeared to be the town hall. There was a man sitting on one of the benches. As I drove past him, he stood up and waved at me, smiling. He too was dressed in a black suit but looked really ragged. Something about his smile made me shudder. I'd been driving for a good 20 minutes before I realized that I should have hit the next town by then. That's when I heard voices, murmuring, reciting, and chanting. I looked around as I drove, but couldn't identify the source. The voices were getting louder, and whether I liked it or not, it seemed like I was soon going to find out where the voices were coming from. I had to ram my brakes so hard that my car screeched. Passing before me was a funeral procession. A funeral procession at fucking midnight. There were at least 100 people walking, a casket being carried around by some of them in the middle. They all walked slowly, with expressionless faces, taking no notice of me. They were chanting something, but I couldn't understand a word of it. There were so many of them walking so slow that I had no chance of cutting through them without the fear of running them over. It had been a few minutes since the head of the procession had passed me, and I was waiting for the entire black parade to end so I could drive by. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw what would probably give me nightmares for ages. It seemed like the procession had gone around the block and was approaching my car from behind, only this time they seemed to be moving faster. And then I finally saw it, a gap between the groups of people walking. I hit the gas pedal as hard as I could have and sped through. As I drove through, I looked into the rearview mirror again and only saw darkness. They were all gone. The streets were empty, as though none of them were ever there. I didn't intend on slowing down anymore, and a few minutes later I saw a board that pointed to a ramp onto the Garden State Parkway. That was all I needed. I sped onto the parkway and was extremely relieved when I saw a few cars drive by. My cellular network was back on. I checked the time and it was still midnight. It was as though time hadn't moved at all since I had gotten off the parkway. The crash had apparently cleared up and I was home in about 30 minutes. I drive by exits 135 and 136 every day on my way to work, and I haven't seen exit 135D again. Remember, if you ever do see any weird exits, refrain from using them, and if you see a town called Morristown, stay away from it at all costs.